evaluates completion of assignments. GCB evaluates completion of text, which is the most important criteria for the course, because if we don't read or watch, we can't learn anything. And we need to show that we did by doing these three things. We need to include specific examples from the text, distribute examples across the text, and cite examples by page number or timestamp. GCC grades the specificity and relevance of the evidence. If we're asked to discuss something, the quote actually needs to pertain to what we're talking about and not just state the obvious. GCD evaluates completion of analysis, or sorry, not completion, complexity of analysis. We're taught in high school to write so that all of our evidence supports one line of argument, but we need to consider more than one plausible interpretation for evidence. One could see it this way, or one could see it that way, whatever makes more sense. Word limits make it hard to be complex because if there's not enough space, you can't fully go on. But where possible, ask how could someone see it differently. GCE gauges clarity and quality of writing, or better said, editing, and that's where AI can be useful. So then grading criteria for all Zoom discussions includes participation, which is listening and speaking, which it'll just be me speaking, text-based contributions and interpretations, and informality, the best discussions or conversations. So there's no need for competition and making sure everyone has a chance to speak. And since it's just me, I'm gonna have like a mock conversation with you. I feel like that's how it would be the most natural. So now going to the millenarian patients part 2 sheet. Just read grading criteria for discussion. So how much I got a chance to read. I got a chance to read the entire first section without skimming. And then for part B, the Shakers earn a 5 on the socioeconomic spectrum. Compared to later experiments in economic equality, like communism, they did well. Their communities also survived for a long time, well over a century, all this despite refusing to procreate. So how did they make it work economically? So the Shakers made it work economically despite refusing to procreate in a few ways. So I said overarchingly, the Shakers were extremely sustainable, self-sufficient, resourceful, and industrious, which allowed them to excel economically. Firstly, they were skilled agriculturally and delegated labor amongst the community, which was extremely efficient. In addition, they were also artisans, making their own furniture, architecture, clothing, and their belongings were all communal, and they believed in sharing work, possessions, which is also a sustainable way to live. This also increased profit and reduced costs. The Shakers also welcomed innovation and encouraged invention. They invented the clothespin, and their craftsmanship was really desirable to other sellers outside of the Shaker community because of their honesty, reliability, and their attention to detail and wanting to make everything they produce perfect. So that gave them financial stability for a while. Their communities survived for a long time due to the appeal of their way of life as well. A lot of people were attracted by their doctrine as well as their way of life, and they had high ranks for a long time, but that did dissipate. It was noted that that was somewhat due to some of the constraints and the necessity of celibacy. Not everyone could commit. I took an excerpt out. I couldn't see page numbers, but I just took a screenshot of the excerpt out here that discusses the structure and kind of the genius behind it and why the Shakers thrived for so long. Basically, they had an intense brand of communalism that they stuck with, their system of communities or families within communities, villages, within a single society allowed the population to expand and contract without much disturbance to economic or social order. It says that if enthusiasm for the gospel increased or decreased in a particular region, the nearest village would simply add or subtract a family. So it's very give and take to make sure that the numbers didn't deplete. Limiting these families to 100 members allowed for a group that was large enough to be financially self-sustaining. They could raise most of their own food, operate several light industries, and reap and sow substantial economics of scale. But small enough to also foster social cohesion, mutual accountability, spiritual intimacy, have an actual community, and know the people around you. And in a group of 100, it says that everyone knows one another. Now turning to governance in section C, the Shakers face a dilemma that all profit-led movements have faced eventually, which is when a leader dies. So how did Shaker governance evolve over time? So after Mother and Lee died, the Shaker governance evolved. That was 1785. They created their first meeting house, and then those started to pop up other places. Following the deaths of her kind of right hands, William Lee, her brother, and then James Whitaker, who had the title of First Elder, that fell to Joseph Meacham, who then decided to appoint Lucy Wright as a co-elder and was basically his female counterpart and was seen as an equal. Um, and she was like the first female in line. And then, as I said, the meeting houses were kind of popping up everywhere else, as well as dorms for women, men, and children. Um, I also nabbed a quote on the organization, which was right before the last quote I said. Um, basically, sorry, I'm trying to find my place. Below it discusses the actual individual organization. So below the lead ministry, there were various categories of elders and eldresses, um, some of whom move around a particular region, conveying directives and overseeing clusters of villages, just kind of the overall in charge. Within each village, there was a group of elders. So in addition to that, usually two men, two women who dealt with matters relating to that specific community. So they're less overarching and more specific pertaining to that actual group of people. Each village made itself up of several families, as I stated before, that were overseen by those two elders and two eldresses. By the time Meacham died, these families had become the basic unit of Shaker life. As the population of a village expanded, it was subdivided into separate families, in which no one family exceeded 100. They ran their own businesses, kept common accounts, received discipline from the same small group of elders. Um, those family elders, those four day-to-day that pertain to that community, were it notes the daily sources of authority. So who was kind of actually in charge, versus who was seen as kind of like a deity religious figure in like a higher sense, if that makes sense. At each of those four levels of authority, family, village, bisrophic, and lead ministry, power was divided equally between men and women. I found that especially interesting, and I wrote one of my questions on that. Elders and eldresses enjoyed certain privileges, but all Shakers lived in the same spare dormitory style rooms and ate the same typically vegetarian food. Even Wright and Meacham, who had their hands full with, it says, administrative and theological matters, always put in time to work or be in the field. And everyone was basically put on an equal playing field and everyone contributed, which I also thought was interesting because I feel like in a lot of societies or communities or religions, you see that the higher ups kind of lay back and at the very most supervise, if not have a hands-off approach. So I found that interesting that they kind of stay apart and they want to be in the heart of everything. Now knowing more about the Shakers than I did before, my couple potential questions here, and whether or not I feel confident with what kind of questions to ask and what am I most curious to ask. So I feel confident in asking these questions. I think also because I am familiar with the clergyman that I'm going to be interviewing. He is the pastor at my church. So I'm very comfortable with him and I'm very comfortable with what kind of questions to ask him, what he has knowledge of, and I feel comfortable explaining our class and our curriculum to give him the necessary background. I'm curious to ask about the intersections of work and faith because I wrote this on our millenarian patients part one. I saw overlaps between the Shakers overall kind of vibe, idea, message, and Ignatian spirituality. I just took the Finding God in All Things course, so we learned a lot about that and Saint Ignatius's spiritual exercises, and I saw overlap. So I'm curious to think, not to think, to ask if Father Bill, who I'm interviewing, draws that connection without me prompting him, or if he doesn't and I prompted, would he agree? Um, so my potential questions. How do the Shakers' emphasis on gender equality reflect their idea of heaven on earth? I think this is really interesting, especially since the Catholic Church does not have a similar gender equality. And then kind of going off of that, is it feasible for such gender role equality to be realized in religious communities today? So basically, I'm asking, is that possible in the Catholic Church? Is that possible in other religions? Do we see that ever happening? Is that something feasible? Then the Shakers thought that they could practice worship through work. In what ways does their blend of work and worship illustrate patience, and bring them closer to God? And then is it possible to achieve advancement in spirituality solely by work, solely via means of, you know, the Shakers doctrine or the Ignatian spiritual exercises? I don't know if you're familiar or if anyone's familiar, but basically Saint Ignatius, especially quoted in, we've read Father O'Brien's Seeing with the Heart book, that you could become closer to God even in like washing your dishes and day-to-day tasks. Is it more than that, or does it boil down to something that simple? Or does it demand further contemplation, further work? So I'm curious as to what he thinks about that as well. And then to close out, um, to read the final two chapters. I'm clarifying that it says two chapters. Um, two paragraphs of the chapter. Okay, that makes more sense. I was gonna say that's a lot of reading to do on my own. Um, but I'm just pulling it up now. Library. Great. Final two. Okay. Okay. So, last two paragraphs. The Shakers' aversion to the world as they found it and their exuberant millenarian hopes combined to liberate them from any regard for the established forms of human association. Within their villages, they built an entirely new kind of society, one founded upon total equality, spiritual transcendence, and utopian faith in the perfectibility of life on earth. We are the people who turned the world upside down, Anne Lee liked to say. Ultimately, life within Zion was less about what the Shakers did than what about they didn't do, namely just about everything that might be called worldly. To them, the state of total abstination, which they called being simple, added up to the doctrine of radical freedom: freedom from appetite, freedom from nature, freedom from impulse, and freedom, perhaps most importantly, from the conventions of the world. By scorching out the lusty, scuffling habits of Babylon, the Shapers hoped to perfect and liberate their souls and their community. Their best known song celebrates this remarkable paradox: I will bow and be simple, I will bow and be free. So, as to what the paradox of the song lyric is, I will bow and be simple, and I'll bow and be free. Their interpretation of simple and what isn't simple is interesting. They believe total abstinence is simple. They believe abandoning all kind of like worldly ideas and possessions is simple, when in reality that's not simple, but to them it is simple. And kind of resorting to simplicity, although it's complex. So, can I think of a time in my childhood when I felt free by living simply in a Shaker sense or in my future? So, I basically just wrote down some notes that I think in my childhood, in a sense, I felt that kind of shaker freedom because I had less worry, less responsibility. I feel like